name's Laura. I'm from Leeds in the north of England. Now, I heard you take submissions from viewers, so I'd like to send mine in. I used to work morning shifts in a petrol station when I was at Loughborough Uni. Any day I had afternoon lectures, I'd get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, work from 6 till 12, then I'd get the bus to uni in time for my 1 o'clock lectures. It was quite a good gig, really. After the morning rush, the last 3 hours or so were usually quite quiet, and if the boss wasn't around, I could sometimes get away with just chilling in the office and reading a book in between serving customers. One morning, a Tuesday it was, a man walked into the petrol station who had to be in maybe his 40s or 50s. His appearance grabbed my attention right away because when I looked up from my book, I saw that he was the spitting image of Mark Bullen from the cover of T-Rex's album Unicorn. My dad, God rest his soul, was a big T-Rex fan, and I used to flick through all of his old LPs when I was a kid. I always found myself transfixed by Mark Bullen's face. He was such a beautiful man when he was alive, but the guy that walked into the petrol station looked like his evil twin or something. He had the same mop of dark curly hair, the same dark, tired-looking eyes, but he had much sharper features and looked extremely gaunt, like a skeleton that someone had papier-mâchéd a thin layer of wet tissue paper on. He was dressed that part too, with a sheepskin coat on, a bright pink t-shirt, and what looked like blue bell-bottom jeans on. It would have been a solid outfit, too, if it wasn't for the sorry state of his clothes that they were in. Instead of them making him look good, even if it was a very vintage kind of good, they just made him look weird, smelly, and creepy. I usually didn't concern myself with people's appearances much. It was a petrol station, not a nightclub, so even Dracula could walk in, fangs all bloody with his cape blowing in the wind, and I wouldn't say a word if he just paid for his fuel and left. And then, under the circumstances, I think I'd rather it was Dracula who walked in that day, as opposed to Mark Bullen's evil twin. He grabbed a pint of milk from the fridge section, walked up to the counter, and asked for X amount of fuel on whatever pump it was. I took his money, gave him his change, and then thanked him for his custom. 99 times out of 10, a bloke would just say, "Cheers, love," and then off they'd go. But evil Bullen stayed by the counter, looked at me, and then said, "You're a pretty young lady, aren't you?" And to say my skin crawled would have been the understatement of the century. I'm not great at taking compliments as it is, which I know is a big me problem, but when the compliments come as greasy and creepily spoken as evil Bullen's, it knocks me pretty sick. And I do mean creepily spoken, too. It wasn't just some throwaway compliments as he was walking out. He drew out the very before pretty like, "You're a very pretty young lady, aren't you?" And the "aren't you" was all squeaky, like he was talking to a kid or something. And I get that we had a big generation gap between us, but I was a grown woman, not a child. Now, even back then, I knew better than to talk back to a stranger like that, and it's not worth the risk. So instead of being lippy with him, I said, "Thank you," in a polite but very reserved way, and then stepped away from the counter to make it look like I had work to do in the stockroom. It was a trick that I'd used once or twice, a gesture that said, "I'd love to stop and chat, but duty calls." And for the most part, the men attempting to flirt with me took the hint and made their way back to their cars. But in evil Bullen's case, I turned my back on him and he immediately asked, "Where are you going?" And with as pleasant a smile as I could manage, I turned back and I was about to tell him I was off into the storage room to carry on my stock count, always a solid excuse, when he said, "Don't walk away from me. I'm trying to talk to you." And there was just a hint of aggression creeping into his voice when he said it too, just enough to get me thinking, uh-oh, this guy's going to be a problem, isn't he? I started explaining that as much as I'd like to stop and chat, I had to work to do. My exact words were, "I'm on the clock," to which he replied, "Well, I'm a customer," and then started telling me how he didn't often get to talk to a girl as pretty as me, so he wanted to make the most of it. I tried telling him that as much as I appreciated the compliment, I'd get into trouble with my boss if I didn't complete my assigned workload. Evil Bullen just waved away my concerns and then told me, "I'll deal with your boss if he complains." Then, just as I was about to reply, he told me, I wish I was as pretty as you. I know some of you might be thinking I'm a bit full of myself, dropping the word pretty a lot, but it was verbatim what he was saying to me. I'm not just using this whole thing to drop a not-so-subtle humble brag, and also I'm bad at handling compliments as it is, but for a grown man to say I wish I was as pretty as you in this slimy, lecherous way was just this whole new level of cringe for me. And in response, the only thing that came to mind for me was to say something about how inappropriate that was in a professional setting. And while I was sure his intentions were pure, self-preservative flattery, by the way, I didn't appreciate him commenting on my appearance. And the guy just laughed like this short chuckle and snort and then asked me, "Don't you like being pretty?" And for the first time in our conversation, I couldn't think of a response, either professional or heartfelt. I just wanted to run into the stockroom, slam the door, and kick the crap out of a few cardboard boxes while pretending that they were Evil Bullen's ballsack. But I was scared that if I did, he might follow me. So instead, I tried my best to stand my ground and repeated that I didn't appreciate his tone or his question, and I then told him that if he didn't leave the premises, I'd call the police. A little bit more of that aggression crept into his voice, and he asked me, "What? You're really gonna call the bloody police just 'cause someone called you pretty? Are you taking the piss?" I didn't even want to engage with him, so I just asked him to leave and added some preemptive thanks to make my point. There was a bit more to and fro with him saying how he was a customer and wasn't going to leave, and then when I pulled out my phone as if to say, "I really am about to call 999, he says this, "You know, if I looked like you, I'd just stay at home all day without a stitch of clothing on, just staring at myself in the mirror." And to this day, that's still one of the most skin-crawlingly creepy things a man has ever said to me, and at the time, I was so angry I could have screamed. But I tried my very best to keep my cool and just asked him to leave again. Bullen's evil twin started going off on one about how I needed to learn to take compliments, and then said he wished he got half the amount of attention that I did, which was just a bizarre thing to say because he didn't even know me. I just kept asking him to leave on repeat, assuming it was just a matter of time before he ran out of steam and did leave. But he kept going, and going, and going. He started saying something about how depressed I'd be when I got older and lost my looks. How, once they'd been taken away from me, I'd be nothing but a pathetic, undesirable waste of oxygen, and I'd end up sticking my head in an oven. This guy was off his rocker, and that comment really pushed me close to the edge in terms of just snapping and screaming at him. But I just gripped my teeth and repeated myself for the umpteenth time that he needed to leave. And that's when he said, "If you don't want the attention, if you don't like being pretty, then I can make you not so pretty if you want." And the threat immediately silenced me, but it didn't paralyze me. And the second after he said that, I brought up on my phone that I had dialed the police, and then I asked for them. The guy did like a sort of fake, outraged laugh, but then his voice changed almost completely. It went from a sort of sneer to a very deep, guttural growl. He said if I had such a big effing problem being pretty, he could come over the counter and smash my face in until I didn't look like a person anymore. He said my friends and family wouldn't recognize me when he was done, and I could forget about any kind strangers calling me pretty because I'd be as ugly on the outside as I was on the inside. And by the time I'd been connected to the police, there was a tremor in my voice as I started telling the operator what was happening. It was probably one of the more stressful experiences of my entire life, to be honest, because while I was watching Bullen's evil twin to make sure he didn't jump over the counter, and while I couldn't help but hear all the horrific stuff he was saying, I had to concentrate on giving all the necessary info to the police. It was like total cerebral overload, and the more stressed I got, the more upset I got. I remember how the bloke said something like, "I'd love to cut your face off and wear it. I'd stare at myself in the mirror and bang on wearing your effing knickers while I pretend that I'm you." I heard that. Then the operator said, "Police are on their way." And then I just lost it. I started screaming at that guy, telling him how the police were on their way, how he was going to get nicked if he didn't screw off while he still had the chance. And only then did he start making his way towards the door, but while he did, he had a load of stuff about how he'd be back the next day to teach me a lesson in manners, and all this other stuff he never followed up on, thank God. The police were there in minutes. I showed them the CCTV footage, and as soon as I did, one of the officers instantly recognized the man who had been harassing me. He said his name was Charles, or Chaz, but that he sometimes told people his name was Alexei Bowie. And I said that he hadn't told me his name. He'd just gone off on one after I didn't giggle and curtsy when he gave me a compliment, and apparently this was something Chaz did a lot. According to one of the coppers, Leicestershire police had already received several complaints regarding Chaz's habit of harassing lone women, especially ones that were working and couldn't otherwise just walk away from him. It was like his thing, and according to one of the officers, he was just weeks away from being arrested and charged. They were still waiting to get the go-ahead from the CPS, but when they did, Chaz was probably going to prison for a few months at the very least. I couldn't have asked for a better outcome, and I think they actually went through with what they said because I never saw that Chaz again. Not around the petrol station and not around town, anywhere. I don't know the guy's actual full name, so I've never been able to look it up to find out how much time he actually got, if any. But the fact that I never saw him around the garage again was a good indicator that he'd finally got what he deserved. Last November, I turned off the highway into a 2-pump gas station in the middle of nowhere at around 1:30 in the morning. I guess I was kind of zonked from how tired I was because as I drove my car up to the pump, everything seemed as normal as could be. My eyes were locked on the pump display as I filled my car up, trying my best to not go a penny over $30, so it was only when I walked over to the kiosk to pay that I noticed something was off. The first thing that got my attention was how there was no one manning this kiosk. At first, I just waited, thinking the employee was just taking a quick bathroom break or something of that nature. But then as I started to look around, I realized the driver of the car at the pump in front of me was nowhere to be seen either. They weren't in their car, and they weren't inside the convenience store. So my first thought was how the driver and the gas station attendant must have been both in the back of the store, I guess. I got this momentary chill, thinking I might have interrupted a robbery or something, and I was suddenly very hesitant to knock on the glass or call for service. I remember turning to check out the car parked in front of me and thinking, if it's a Honda, then I'm getting out of here. But it looked to me like it was a 2011 3 Series. Now, if you don't know cars, Hondas are easy to steal. BMWs, on the other hand, not so much. And while that didn't completely preclude the possibility that there was a robbery in progress, it reassured me enough that I started knocking on the glass and asking if there was anyone there. I knocked once and then twice, and then after the third time, I knocked on the glass in as many minutes, and it hit me that something highly unusual was clearly going on. My first thought was to try the door to the convenience store. I'm pretty sure it was supposed to be locked, but when I pushed, the door swung right open for me. I walked up to the counter calling out, "Hello?" the whole time. And then thinking there might have been some kind of medical emergency, I jumped the counter and took a look around the back of the store. There was a bathroom and a storage room and a small office, but all three were unlocked and empty. Then and only then did I realize that the entire gas station was completely deserted. I checked around the back just to be sure, but I figured that there'd be no one there. And then once I was 100% sure something seriously weird was going on, I pulled out my phone and got ready to dial 911. I wasn't still 100% sure what to do, so I called out hello again, but much louder. And when that got no response, I called the cops. I could tell that, at first anyway, that the dispatcher thought that I was just some jerk customer who was angry my gas station attendant wasn't there when I needed them. But once I properly explained that there was literally no one to be found, anywhere on the premises or elsewhere, she started to take my call a little more seriously. She asked where I was, and when I told her, she asked if it looked like there had been a robbery. I remember asking, how the hell would I know? But she explained that if there had been a robbery recently, an employee might still be hiding somewhere. And I felt this sort of twinge of frustration because, like I said, I'd looked probably everywhere except the dumpster around the side of the gas station. And as I'm walking back from checking out the highway for signs of life, I just so happened to be passing it as the thought to open it popped into my head. I wanted to be able to say to the dispatcher, "There, I even checked the station's dumpster. There's definitely nobody here, ma'am." But when I opened the dumpster, there they were. I only caught a glimpse of what was inside before I dropped the lid of that dumpster and backed off like the thing was radioactive. But a glimpse was enough for me. There were 2 bodies in there, all bent out of shape with dark stains all over their clothes, and one of them was almost certainly wearing a gas station uniform. I remember saying something like, "Oh, Jesus, oh my God," pacing away from the dumpster in a state of total shock, with the dispatcher in my ear. Sir, tell me what's going on, sir." And I told her, "They're in the dumpster. Jesus fucking Christ, they're in the goddamn dumpster." The cops arrived in about 10 to 15 minutes, and by then I'd run off near to the highway to puke up all the contents of my stomach. And I'd remembered that thing about preserving the integrity of crime scenes, so in a wild panic, I'd actually puked as I was running, then had to hold puke in my mouth for a few seconds before I puked even more out near the highway. And after that, I just walked back and forth hitting my vape until I saw a cop car heading towards me down the highway, and then after talking to one of the officers for a few minutes, he told me I was free to leave. I looked the whole thing up online the first chance that I got later, but although I found a bunch of stories about a member of the public, yours truly, finding some bodies at a gas station, there was nothing that explained how or why those 2 people had been killed. And ever since, I've always been extra careful while driving at night, both in the sense that I keep a very close eye on my fuel gauge and try to avoid any nocturnal pit stops, but also, if a gas station looks a little too quiet, I'll avoid it altogether and just head to the next one. I used to work nights at a gas station called North Star Mart out near a place called Foster in rural Virginia. I used to drive up from Gloucester, get there at around 10 p.m., and then work all through the night until 6 a.m. when my boss, a dude named Judd, came over to relieve me. Judd lived right next door to the gas station in a big old house that he claimed that he built himself. There was no way that he built that whole thing on his own, but he was far too nice for me to call him out on it, so I just let it be. He was a great boss, too. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Not many folks can say that they had a boss who had done almost anything to keep them safe, but I can, and it makes me feel a little guilty sometimes that I don't head up there to visit him more. But I don't like driving around Foster anymore. I don't like going anywhere near the place, and by the end of this story, I think you're going to understand why. I worked at the North Star for 9 months and 3 weeks, working anything from 2 to 5 nights a week, depending on how busy I was at school. Not a single customer in all the time I worked there ever gave me a single ounce of trouble. It was one of the best jobs I ever had in that respect. It was always a little busier on weekends, but during weeknights, I'd sometimes serve only 2 or 3 customers a night and spend the rest of my time watching movies on my iPod, back when that was like a revolutionary thing to do. Judd was really chill like that. He didn't give me a bunch of cleaning tasks, and he didn't give me any busy work at all, actually. And he only ever had one rule. If anyone ever showed up late at night, acting weird in any way, I was to call him right away. It didn't matter if the call woke him and his wife up from the sweetest dreams they'd ever had. If anyone was acting sketch, Judd wanted to know about it. I figured that was fair enough. The gas station was Judd's whole life. It was his retirement plan, so if it went up in flames, well, you see where I'm going with this. So even though it felt slightly emasculating, as in I felt like I could take care of the station myself, I agreed to give Judd a call every time there was any disturbances. When he first told me about his little golden rule, I'd be lying if I said that it didn't make me a little nervous, I guess. It suggested that there were a lot of weird people who came by the gas station at night, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Like I said, 9 whole months and not a single instance of weird or disturbing behavior. And then one night, it happened. I was in the back office one night, splitting my attention between security monitors and a copy of The Dark Knight Rises, when I suddenly saw a lone figure approaching the gas station. We had 3 cameras, one facing the pumps, one facing the approach to the store, and a third which allowed me to watch the inside of the store from the back office. I can see the guy walking towards the store, past the pumps, and then into the view of the second camera, but then instead of walking into the store like literally everybody else, he stops dead outside the door. He's right in the view of the second camera, so I'm looking at this guy fairly close up, and he looked like a perfectly regular rural Virginian dad type. He looked like he had work boots on, some faded jeans, and a baseball cap with some kind of hunting or fishing logo on it. Literally the most unremarkable looking guy that could ever walk through our door. But his behavior most definitely got my attention. I guess it's not entirely true that nothing weird ever happened, because there was one previous occasion where I called Judd in the middle of the night. Some crazy lady was screaming like a demon out near the pumps. It was a Saturday, and it had to be maybe 4 to 4:30 in the morning, but just like Judd said, I gave him a call at his house. I told him about the lady and how her screaming was freaking me out. He asked for a description, I gave him one, and then he tells me, "Oh, that's just Rhonda liquored up on payday. She'll head home once she's tired herself out." And then you know what? She did. She eventually stopped screaming and then just kind of walked off, like she was done with that night's performance. Anyway, the guy in the sporting goods cap stopped dead and just stood there in front of the camera, not moving a muscle. Not nearly as freaky as screaming like a banshee, but still weird nonetheless. I figured he was, I don't know, taking a moment to think or something. But then, as I'm watching him, his head starts slowly moving, turning his neck until he's staring into the camera lens. I know it was just an illusion, but it felt like he was staring directly at me, and that was easily one of the most unnerving sensations I've ever experienced. Once the guy's behavior reached a concerning level of weird, I grabbed the phone and called Judd. I didn't even feel emasculated doing it either. Whatever that guy's problem was, it wasn't meth. It was something way scarier than that. Judd picked up the phone, then once again he asked me to describe the person acting weird. I started describing the guy, and then the next thing, Judd slams the phone down. I look back at the screen and the guy's disappeared from view, but he's not in the store either, so I'm thinking, where the hell's he gone? But at the same time, I'm also thinking, why did Judd just slam that phone down on me? He told me to call him if something weird started to happen, and the first time he sounded sleepy but pretty calm, so I was wondering what was so different about that time, when I suddenly see him on the monitors. Judd was running towards the gas station in nothing but his boxer shorts and a wife beater, and he was carrying a shotgun in his hands. He burst into the store and asked me where he is. Then when I say the guy just disappeared, and that I think he just walked off, Judd runs past me into the office to check the monitors. I'm freaking out too, because what the hell is he carrying that shotgun for? But no matter how many times I asked him what's going on, he kept silencing me and telling me that I needed to concentrate as he ran back to the security footage to get a look at the guy's face. I watched him, rewinding the footage until he finally found what he was looking for, and when he did, I watched Judd turn completely pale. Whoever it was, Judd was terrified of him. So terrified that he felt the need to come running over with a shotgun to protect me, and then that scared the hell out of me too. Judd sent me home that night after calling the cops, and the next day, he called to say that he'd understand if I didn't want to come back to work. I asked just one time if he could tell me who the man was, and Judd paused and then repeated the part about understanding if I didn't want to come back. I thanked him for the job, wished him luck, and then just hung up. Like I said earlier, I still feel guilty about not going up to see him more. He was a great guy and a great boss, but without knowing who that guy was, without knowing why Judd was so scared of him, I couldn't put myself in the position of working for him anymore. I didn't want to die for some stupid gas station job, no matter how cool my boss was. And if there was a guy out there who scared the hell out of one of the toughest sons of bitches I'd ever known, then what chance in hell did I have? Back when I was in my senior year of high school, I used to work weekends at a rural gas station here in my home state of Nebraska. I worked second shift every Saturday and Sunday, so 2 p.m. to around 9 p.m., and early one summer's afternoon, I set off to work with nothing but a few wispy clouds and a clear blue sky. Now call me sentimental, but I love driving around Nebraska. I don't think there's any place quite like it. You hit the highway from some small town and it's like the whole world stretches out in front of you for as far as the eye can see. There's an almost unbroken skyline, only occasionally interrupted by a windmill, a barn, or a cluster of trees. It can look pretty as a picture on a sunny day, and up until that point, May had brought only sunshine and showers. But as I drove along the highway that afternoon and looked off into the distance, I saw some really scary-looking storm clouds rolling in. The general rule is that most storm clouds look much scarier than they actually are, especially when there's that big wall of angry-looking clouds facing you down like something straight out of the Bible. But most of the time, you get a little rain, you get a little wind, and nothing much else to worry about. However, on this occasion, something told me it was going to be a bad one, and by the time I got to the gas station, the storm warnings were being sounded over by local radio stations. My coworker and I normally did a quick handover, but since we got the storm warnings, we both had a hell of a lot more work on our hands. We had to lock all the windows, then either secure all of our outdoor fixtures or drag them inside, and then we had to inspect the pumps and all that kind of stuff before shutting off the fuel completely. My coworker went off to fuel up the generator just in case we lost power, as I went off to assemble a bunch of flashlights and batteries. And we obviously can't use candles with it being a gas station, so it's a major priority. We already had our designated shelter lined up, the station's office, so after ensuring the first aid kit was fully stocked, we kept the radio tuned up and our ears wide open for weather alerts and other announcements. We figured people would stay home and we'd be in for a pretty turbulent but relatively lonely shift, but we were wrong. One by one, 3 cars rolled into the front over the course of about an hour, 2 driven by single people and the other containing a mom and her 2 young daughters. Wherever they'd been, the path home led directly through the storm, so instead of risking their lives, they came to us and begged for shelter. And we couldn't say no to them. We weren't exactly equipped to shelter that many people, especially not overnight, but there was just no turning them away under these circumstances. We let everybody help themselves to drinks and snacks if they were hungry, mainly to try and calm their nerves as the incoming storm got worse and worse. And boy, oh boy, did it get worse. We all stayed relatively calm until we heard the tornado sirens going off. I'm pretty sure all the grown-ups there had heard the sound before, but it scared the hell out of the younger woman's 2 daughters, who started screaming and crying and begging their mom to take them home. Then, when stuff started flying off of our roof, a piece of debris hit one of their cars, and the sound of the alarm made the kids cry even harder. And the poor things just didn't understand what was happening. It only took a few more moments of stuff falling off of our roof before we knew that we had to find shelter in the station's office. There was just enough room to fit everyone, and thankfully, with the office shielding us from the sound of the sirens and the howling winds, the 2 little girls started to calm down a little. But when something flew across the parking lot and smashed through the big plate glass window, it made a sound like a freaking bomb exploding. And the sound scared the hell out of me and a coworker, and by that point, we were kind of expecting it. But the 2 little girls nearly lost their minds. They must have thought the whole building was coming down, and so did one of the single drivers, because as the girls started shrieking, she had some kind of panic attack and tried to run back to her car. Once we realized what she was trying to do, my coworker lunged at her, telling her how going outside meant absolute death, and she wouldn't listen. She tried to fight my coworker, screaming and flailing, and it took me and the other single driver to subdue her. The little girls were screeching so hard they could barely breathe, watching as she struggled a little more and then just burst into tears. Then and only then did she stop struggling, as she cried and told us over and over again that she was sorry. We rode out the storm together for the next few hours, and I remember how the thing that really united us and kept us from getting too frightened was the goal of keeping those two little girls from screaming themselves unconscious. I worked so hard at keeping them calm and reassuring them that we were all going to be just fine. But sometimes, when I think about it, I think we were all trying to reassure ourselves too, and talking to them little girls like we were was sort of projecting, I think. Eventually the sounds of the winds died down, and after about an hour or so, it looked like it was safe for everyone to make a move. We walked into the store to find it absolutely trashed, and so much stuff had blown in that it was impossible to determine what exactly had smashed the window and made that explosion sound. Glass, snacks, magazines, and debris were just everywhere, and we had to tread very carefully over it all to keep from falling on the carpet of shards. The folks thanked us before they got into their cars, especially the young mom, who thanked the other two drivers for helping keep her daughters calm when she too was almost losing her mind. After that, everyone except me and my coworker went their separate ways, leaving me and him like, what in the hell did we just go through? On Thursday, April 16th of 1987, 4-year-old Marlena Childress was playing with her toys out in her family's front yard. Marlena lived in Union City, Tennessee, with her 22-year-old mother, Pamela Bailey, along with her stepfather, Johnny, and her 4-month-old half-brother, Damon. Also, attending the house that day was Marlena's 7-year-old stepbrother, Jerry, who was present until he was picked up by his mother at around 3 in the afternoon. At around 3:30 p.m., with Marlena still playing in the front yard, her mother washed dishes while watching her daughter through the large, double-hung kitchen window. Pam looked down for mere moments, scrubbing and rinsing a few dishes until she heard the screech and skidding of car tires coming from the street outside. She looked up and saw a red vehicle with Kentucky license plates speeding down the street and away from her home. At first, Pam simply shook her head and returned to her work. Yet seconds later, she was hit with a terrifying realization. She peered through the window again. Then, as a choking panic erupted in her chest, she rushed outside into her front yard to find that little Marlena was nowhere to be seen. Following a frenzied search of the surrounding area, Pamela rushed to contact the police. She strongly suspected that her 4-year-old daughter had just been abducted by someone driving a red car with Kentucky license plates specific to McCracken County in the state's far west. Not just because it was seen speeding down the street, but because someone driving the exact same vehicle had approached her daughter at a nearby gas station just hours before she went missing. After surrendering to the kids' demands, Pam had taken Marlena and her brother Jerry to a nearby gas station to pick up some candy. After obtaining her sweet treats and in her excitement to return home, little Marlena had run out of the store following her mother's purchases with the goal of being the first back to the car. Pamela quickly followed her daughter out into the gas station's parking lot, calling out to her as she went, only to find her staring up at a man she didn't recognize. The man leaned forward, towering over the frightened child, and began talking to her, but when confronted by Pamela, he excused himself and walked away. Pamela gently scolded little Marlena and told her not to go rushing off like that in public places. Then, as her tearful daughter apologized, Pam traced the strange man's path and saw him climbing into the driver's seat of a red car with McCracken County plates. Officers from the Union City Police Department rushed to apprehend their suspect and tracked him down to his old Kentucky home. He seemed surprised by their arrival, admitted to having talked to the little girl at the gas station back in Tennessee, and even consented to a brief search of his home to confirm Marlena wasn't there. Police all but ruled him out as a suspect, and after extensive interviews with Marlena's stepfather, as well as her biological father, they too were cleared of suspicion. The investigation continued for another 6 weeks, with police becoming more and more exasperated with the lack of progress, until one day, a deeply shocking confession rocked the local community. On June 8th of 1987, Pam was talking with a private investigator named Stan Cavness. Cavness had been hired at the behest of Pam's family, who were frustrated with the tepid progress of investigating police. And one day, he and Pamela were conducting a tape-recorded interview. Pamela began talking about the day Marlena went missing and how her misbehavior was becoming increasingly unmanageable. Marlena's behavior got worse and worse while Pam got more and more stressed. Then finally, after a bout of near riotous misconduct, Pamela snapped, spun around, and struck her daughter on the back of the head. She hit with such force that little Marlena wobbled, took a tumble, then struck her head on the corner of a nearby table as she fell. Pamela rushed to her daughter's aid, but was horrified to discover that smashing her temple against a pointed wooden corner had suddenly and quite definitely killed her. Pamela continued her confession, fully aware that she was being recorded, telling Cavness that once she realized Marlena was dead, she'd hidden her body in the trunk of her car. She then drove said vehicle to the nearby town of Martin, where she contacted a family friend named P.L. Summers and arranged to meet him at a bridge on Campground Road. There, they carried the dead girl's corpse from the trunk of Pam's car and then tossed it into Obion River. Investigator Stan Cavness was stunned. He asked Pamela to confirm that what she was saying was the truth. Then when she nodded, he informed her of his obligation to inform the police. On the tape, a tearful Pamela states that she understands, then Cavness pushed a button and the recording ends. Cavness immediately contacted the Union City Police Department, with whom he'd already been working closely with, and informed them of Pamela's shocking confession. She was subsequently arrested on charges of second-degree murder, and a team of highly trained police divers were sent to trawl the Obion for any trace of Marlena's remains. But this is where the case becomes as vexing as it is chilling. Tennessee's Obion River is a relatively slow-moving and meandering watercourse. Heavy rains can temporarily increase its speed and water level, particularly in the winter and spring when rainfall increases. But in its natural state, much of the Obion consists of slow-moving waters, especially in the lower stretches, where it flows at a much more leisurely pace as it approaches the Great Mississippi. According to Pamela, she and her friend had tossed her late daughter's body into the water during the small hours of April 17th, a time when most of the spring rains had come and gone. This meant that by early June, a team of divers would most certainly have been able to recover any human remains that were tossed into the Obion just 2 months prior. But strangely, despite an intense search that spanned multiple days, not a single trace of Marlena's body could be found. Curious regarding the inconsistency in her story, homicide detectives visited Pamela whilst in custody and asked her to confirm the location of the dumping site. It was here that Pamela once again shocked investigators by recanting her entire confession. Pamela explained that just days prior to the taped confession with Stan Cavness, she'd been released from a psychiatric hospital. The stress of losing her daughter had been too much to bear, so after a brief stay under the care of medical professionals, she was released having been prescribed a cocktail of antidepressants. Pam then claimed that not only had she been high as a kite during the taped conversation with Cavness, but he'd heavily intimidated her prior to its recording, having used the threat of the electric chair to coerce a confession. Police then asked her what involvement, if any, her friend P.L. Summers had in her daughter's disappearance, and Pam made yet another astonishing claim. Summers wasn't her friend. He'd been her lifelong abuser, and it was he that had abducted and murdered little Marlena. According to Pamela, Summers' interest in her would wax and wane. Sometimes he'd be a constant menace, demanding satisfaction whenever the mood took him. Other times, he'd leave her in peace for months on end, but he always came back for more. Then one day, after Summers called to arrange a date, she decided that enough was enough. Summers stopped by, but instead of giving in to him, Pamela fought off his advances and then threatened to call the police. Summers' response was to threaten Marlena's life, and then a few weeks later, there's a screech of tires while she's washing dishes and her little girl was gone. A decidedly puzzled pair of homicide detectives then paid a visit to P.L. Summers at his home. There, they informed him of the accusations, and his reaction was incredulous. Summers categorically denied Pamela's shocking claim and retorted by painting her as a liar of pathological proportions. He stated he and Pamela had shared a brief dalliance many years ago, and that he didn't even know that she had a daughter, let alone kidnapped and murdered her. Police then asked Summers if he had an alibi for the day of Marlena's abduction. He responded by listing several, all of which proved credible when cross-referenced by detectives. Police had no choice but to rule Summers out as a potential suspect, but here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Just months later, P.L. Summers was arrested on charges of molesting a 9-year-old boy. An article from the Kentucky-based Paducah Sun, dated September 30th of 1987, states that a 65-year-old named P.L. Summers was arrested the previous afternoon on charges of aggravated battery. And what's more, Summers was arrested after a traumatized child approached their parents. He wasn't caught at the scene. It wasn't some kind of sting. Summers was visited at his home at around 4 hours after the attack. Unless the 9-year-old he was accused of molesting had a photographic memory and a talent for articulating the finer details of a person's appearance, it's safe to say that the police considered him a suspect due to his history of child abuse. As it turns out, there was some degree of truth to Pamela's frightful claims, but the fate of her daughter remained a deeply troubling mystery. Many police officers doubted Pam's story and others doubted her sanity, but all agreed that without a body or any other kind of solid evidence, the chance of getting a conviction was highly improbable. Free to move on with their life, Pamela Bailey found that she couldn't continue living in Union City and relocated to Mayfield, Kentucky, around 40 miles northeast of her childhood home. 2 years later, sometime in early 1990, Pamela gave birth to a son that she named Casey, and for 12 long years they lived in peace and harmony. Then, on April 22nd of 2002, just a few months after Casey's 12th birthday, Pamela told her young son that she had a surprise for him and asked him to put on a blindfold. Casey did as she was told before his mother led him out to the car and helped her son into the passenger seat. 6 days prior marked the 15th anniversary of Marlena's disappearance. She would have been 19 years old had she been alive. Pamela drove her son all the way to the mystery destination she'd picked out, then carefully helped him from the passenger seat and led him off into the unknown. Casey kept asking if he could take off the blindfold, yet his mother told him no, that he had to wait until the right moment. He felt grass, soft and spongy under the soles of his sneakers, and then suddenly, his mother brought him to an abrupt halt and told him to take off his blindfold. When Casey did so, his first reaction was utter confusion. He believed his mother was taking him somewhere exciting or fun, potentially as a belated birthday present. Instead, she'd taken him to a cemetery. Casey looked around, wondering what in the world his mother was thinking, when he suddenly spotted a clue to the purpose of their visit. Before him, a single word was etched into a small, child-sized gravestone. "Son," it said. Casey turned to see his mother brandishing a knife. He tried to run, but she grabbed his shirt, stabbing him once in the back of the neck and twice through the flesh atop his shoulder. Thankfully, Casey's quick thinking and decisive action saved his life. His dynamic movement meant the stab wounds inflicted by his own mother were only relatively minor. He escaped, sought help, and then fully recovered following a brief stay in a hospital. Pamela was once again arrested on charges of harming one of her own children, but when questioned, claimed that she had no memory of the event and must have blacked out for the duration. She was subsequently charged with attempted murder, but after a period of legal wrangling ended up pleading no contest to charges of second-degree assault. She received a 10-year prison sentence, but was released after serving just 2/3 of her time. And while she was in prison, police took the opportunity to reopen the investigation into the disappearance of Marlena Childress. But despite their best efforts, they were unable to make any solid progress in their investigation. Some detectives remained firm in their position that Pam, who had already admitted to harming one of her children, was responsible for Marlena's death. Others weren't so sure. According to one former homicide detective, there was a potentially credible sighting of Marlena at a Memphis hair salon just 6 days after she went missing. Two hairstylists claimed that a girl with a strong resemblance to Marlena was brought into their salon by two grown women who also appeared to be the guardian of a similarly aged boy. The women asked for the little girl's hair to be styled, but during the cut, the little girl kept sobbing and saying that she wanted her mother. The stylist claimed the women referred to the girl as Marlena, but thought very little of the encounter until they saw the girl's picture in a local newspaper. At which point, they seemed convinced that little Marlena and the sobbing child were one and the same. Following the reported sighting, Marlena's maternal grandfather drove all the way to Memphis to personally verify the story. LaWade Strickland tracked down one of the women that had reportedly brought Marlena for a haircut, but after she was questioned by police, it was determined the little girl had not been his missing granddaughter. Yet in their haste to pursue more recent leads, investigators appear to have neglected what is arguably their strongest avenue of investigation, the man in the red car. Despite having his name stricken from the list of potential suspects, the involvement of the mysterious driver with McCracken County plates has never been fully explored. Not only was his vehicle spotted speeding away from the scene of Marlena's abduction, but they just so happened to bump into one another in a gas station parking lot just hours before. Police seem to have assumed that since Marlena was sitting on the man's couch or at his kitchen table, she couldn't possibly have been present in the home, yet their search appears to have been skin deep. The driver could have drugged Marlena to keep her quiet before secreting her away in a very discreet hiding place. Alternatively, he could have handed Marlena off to an accomplice in the hours between speeding away from her home and arriving back in McCracken County on the other side of the Kentucky-Tennessee state line. It's entirely possible that Pamela was in cahoots with this mystery driver and made a calculated decision to confuse and frustrate any subsequent investigation by claiming that she had been her daughter's killer. But if that was the case, why arrange for her daughter to be abducted in the first place? If 22-year-old Pam believed that she was too young to be a full-time mother, she could have easily placed her daughter into adoptive care. But that would have come with a degree of stigma, a sense that she'd given up. However, arrange for Marlena to go missing, especially if it happened during a brief lapse in her otherwise attentive care, that would leave Pam blameless. But what if Pam had a little more to gain than just her freedom? What if she lied about her daughter's fate in order to mask an immense personal gain? What if Pamela Bailey sold her child? Between 1924 and 1960, a woman from Memphis named Georgia Tan stole and sold up to 5,000 different children. Operating under the cover of her position at the Tennessee Children's Home Society, Tan arranged for the children to be adopted in exchange for vast sums of cash. She performed no background checks on the people she sold children to, meaning there's a good chance that she deliberately sold children to people who would exploit their labor or exploit their innocence. Tan charged anywhere from $700 to $10,000, and during a speech in 1944, had the audacity to accuse other adoption agencies of trafficking vulnerable children for profit. Incredibly, one child stolen and sold by Georgia Tan grew up to be a household name. Born as Fred Phillips, the infant boy was sold to Kathleen and Richard Fleer sometime in early 1949 or 1950, who went on to settle in the state of Minnesota before renaming the boy Richard. The boy grew up an athlete, and by the early 1970s was well on his way to becoming the styling, profiling, limousine-riding, jet-flying, kiss-stealing, wheeling and dealing son of a gun, Rick, the Nature Boy Flair. The point is that even some of America's most beloved public figures were once bought and sold as children. Sadly, Georgia Tan died of uterine cancer 3 days before the state filed charges against her, and thus escaped justice. But there's no evidence that the network she operated was effectively dismantled. It's estimated that Georgia Tan had made somewhere in the region of $120,000 from the sale of orphaned children, which in today's money is almost $1.2 million. An industry that profitable doesn't just disappear overnight, and it seems far too much of a coincidence that Tan's trafficking operation and Marlena's mysterious disappearance occurred in the exact same state. It makes very little sense that Pam Bailey would be working in cahoots with the driver of the red car, only to then swiftly report him to the police. But what if the driver was a well-placed decoy, employed as part of a vast, historic human trafficking network that's existed for 100 years? What if she felt so guilty and was so acutely aware of the evil that lurks in the shadows of our society that her ultimate gift to her 12-year-old son was eternal, dreamless sleep? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, ladyfingers don't have fingerprints.